Hello, good evening, class. Welcome back, scholars. I hope everyone had a good day. Yes, so today again it is a premiere video. I'm very sorry about that, but I hope you all learned something out of this. Before actually moving forward, I would like to give a brief introduction about myself. I am Nikita and I am the history educator for standard 11th and 12th. As of now, I'm only taking classes for standard 12, but starting from September 1st, for both 11th class and 12th class, I will be taking classes. And yes, a little bit about me. I have very recently graduated from Ashoka University with a bachelor's degree in history and a minor in political science. And I am doing a ASP right now in the same college. So, yes, before the actual topic, before continuing chapter 3, I would like to tell you all about some of the features or benefits you can actually avail by subscribing to Unacademy Plus. Here, most of the features are you can actually learn live just by sitting at the comfort of your own houses and listen to some of the top classes by the top educators of India, all available on one platform, which is Unacademy Plus, and you will have access to unlimited number of resources, right? It can be any video from any department or subject, and there are also regular doubt clearing sessions and also answer writing sessions. You all can also take part in practice tests and live test series. And one thing y'all can place your bet on is that here educators at Unacademy Plus, they make sure that they are covering the syllabus in a very exhaustive manner, so you don't have to worry about missing out on a particular topic or a theme. So that way you are sorted, guys. And here there's also mentorship and guidance given to you, along with the provision for study materials in the form of PDF. And the way you can actually avail Unacademy Plus subscription, there are basically five ranges. Starting from 6 months, there's a 12-month subscription, 15-month subscription, 18 and 24-month subscription as well. The costs are pretty clear here. You have to pay 10,000 for 6 months, and if you break that down per month, it's gonna cost you 1667, right? So all the prices are visible here, but the fact is, the longer period of time you actually take a subscription for, the more beneficial it's gonna be for you. And not just Unacademy Plus, Unacademy also has iconic subscriptions here. Here, the features are even more better and greater than Unacademy Plus because there will be personal mentorship given to you. You can literally approach your personal mentor for any doubts regarding the subject, and there are also live doubt solving sessions along with weekly reports given to you all. There'll be a direct parent connect between the personal mentor and your parents, and also there'll be provision for study planners. With this, the range of subscriptions are similar when compared to Unacademy Plus. 6 months, 12 months, 15, 18 and 24, and the price varies a little bit, but the concept remains the same. The larger period of subscription you take for a longer period, the more beneficial it's going to be. Yes, so today we'll be talking about chapter 3. We've already had two classes on chapter 3. This is the third class, part 3 of chapter 3. We will be continuing from where we left off, basically by referring to the centuries mentioned here in this 12 centuries time span, right? So we had a class yesterday. Today it'll be a continuation to it where we start with jatis and social mobility, right? So yesterday we've talked about caste in detail, like how are occupations associated with caste, like the fourfold caste system and all that stuff. Today we'll be talking about another concept called jatis. Here already there are complexities in social life, right? As we have seen, there are some things mentioned in Brahmanical texts but that did not mean that society functioned according to the Brahmanical text, right? There are many layers beneath it. There are different social realities. So added to that is jatis. So here, according to the Brahmanical tradition, again, jatis, just like the varnas, were based on birth. Again, the origin here is the birth. You cannot change that. They both have a very similar origin, be it jati or varna, which is nothing but the birth. But there is one difference between jati and varna, guys. So that one difference being in the number of varnas and jatis, right? Like if you consider varnas, for example, we know for a fact it is a fourfold social structure, and varnas are fixed in number. You can't change the number of varnas. But if you come to jatis, you can add as many as you want as you keep going forward, right? For example, let's just estimate a rough number. Let's say in 600 BCE there were 50 jatis. This is a rough number. I'm not giving you the approximate actual number. Let's say 50 jatis were there. Moving a century forward, a couple more have been added and the number has been raised to 70, let's say. So the thing basically I mean here is there are no restrictions, like no restrictions at all when it comes to the number of jatis, right? So how actually these jatis were added, like some change has to take place or somebody has to add these jatis to the existing number of jatis for it to increase, right? So what did they do, like what actually happened? If you look at this point, Brahmanical authorities, whenever they encountered new groups or new occupations, right? For example, nishadas. We've talked in the case of Ekalavya in yesterday's class that nishadas are nothing but forest dwellers, people who reside in the forest. So these people, according to the fourfold caste structure, they do not fall under any of those four categories, right? Clearly, forest dwellers is one such occupation which is not mentioned in any of the four social orders. So this is a new group that the Brahmins have been encountering, right? So that is one. Or another thing is goldsmiths, right? So goldsmiths also do not have any order given to them. This is again a new occupation which was coming up in the 6th 5th centuries BCs, right? So they can't be fixed into the already existing social order. So because of that, because they can't be fit into the already existing social order, Brahmanical authorities came up with this new concept called jatis. So whatever extra occupations they found, they just considered it as a jati. That is how jatis kept increasing in number as the years passed by. The next point about jatis is that jatis which shared a common occupation or profession were sometimes organized into shrenis or guilds. The point is pretty clear here. It's very easy to understand. But one thing to notice is that when we were dealing with chapter 2, in specific, we've talked about how shrenis or guilds were associations of merchants. Like it was specifically merchants, right? But if you see here, they are telling any occupation or any profession, they can be clubbed together and called as shrenis. So here the thing is, the scope of the shreni or the scope of guilds have extended to other professions as well, but not just merchants. So that is an important point to consider here. Yes, so from that slide we move on to the next. Here the thing is, subaltern histories, right? Again, I've told you all what subaltern is a couple of classes before, where we were talking about, in the 19th and 20th century, there was a focus on political history, and then a couple of decades later, in the mid 20th century, focus shifted from political history to economics and social history. After that, historians started focusing on marginalized groups, right? Like that minority groups. Marginalized literature is also known as subaltern literature, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, subaltern literature. So here we rarely come across the histories of common people, right? Because simple point, they did not maintain records, or we don't have accounts of their lives. That is why it is very difficult for us to analyze how common people led their lives. We rarely have data or accounts. But there is one exception here. We do have a inscription which actually talks about a particular marginalized community, basically silk weavers to be very specific. So this inscription is found in Mandsaur. Mandsaur is a place in present day Madhya Pradesh, but this place Mandsaur was previously, or earlier it was called as Dashapura, right? So Dashapura was the name it had in 5th century BCE, but now it is called as Mandsaur and it is in present day UP. It is a stone inscription, guys. It is not a copper plate inscription. It is a stone inscription which belonged to the 5th century CE, 5 centuries after Christ, right? So here, this particular inscription talks about the guild of silk weavers, right? So this is a Shreni again. The technical term for guild is Shreni. So it is a association of silk weavers who, this is originally, sorry, like who originally lived in Gujarat, right? So Gujarat is towards the western side of the Indian subcontinent. They originally lived there, but they took a lot of difficulty migrating from Gujarat to Mandsaur, which is in present day Madhya Pradesh, right? So they must have traveled almost like hundreds and thousands of kilometers from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh, like the whole group of silk weavers, right? And there is a reason they particularly traveled to this place. The reason being, they have heard that the local king in Mandsaur was very humble and he treated his subjects with so much love, care, attention. Like basically, his ruling was very effective, right? Like his administration was very effective, and people wanted to reside in such a place where there was a king who could look after his subjects. So, because they liked the king and the kingdom, they migrated from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh. They undertook a very difficult journey along with the old people and their children. So, yes, when you look at this inscription, honestly speaking, it provides a fascinating glimpse of social processes by providing insights into the nature of guilds, right? Like it gives us all the details that that particular group of silk weavers were up to, like what kind of social life they had, what is the social order or social processes prevailing in that particular guild, right? So if you read this inscription, you will get a lot of data on the silk weavers. Firstly, here if you look at this point, what we know typically about guilds is that the membership was based on the shared craft specialization. For example, if I'm a goldsmith and if another person is also a goldsmith, then both of us can come together and form a guild. That is the basic assumption we had about guilds, right? Like people belonging to same craft specialization or same occupation can come together and form guilds. But here, the inscription says that no, that is not the case because members belonged to different occupations, but they are of the same guild. So, this basically eliminates that misconception we have, right? So, this indicates that members shared more than a common profession. It's not just because of the same profession they had that they formed a guild, but they also had a very personal connection. Like they also had like private affairs with one another, right? So that is one point which is clear from this inscription. The other thing is, despite them having different occupations and professions, they collectively came together and they invested all the money, whatever they have earned through their crafts, to build a splendid temple in honor of the sun god. Back in those times, sun god was very important. Like the sun god had a very unique place in terms of Hindu religion back then. Even now, like Hindus, even now till today, they worship sun god, but back in those days his importance was even greater when compared to now. So they built a temple for sun god, right? They invested their own money, they came together, they collectively raised funds or whatever that is, and they built a temple for sun god. Yes, so this is source 8 of your textbook, basically the um, Silk Weavers Guild expert from the inscription itself. I've just included this for y'all to look at all the lines here so that you will come across so many occupations, right? So here it says some are musicians, some are authors, like they write different texts or books or biographies and all, and some are religiously very well read, like they must have read all the Vedas or Upanishads and they're religiously very sound, or some are some performed religious rites, right? So also others are interested in astronomy, some mastered the valorous in battles, right? So if you read all the lines, it is pretty clear that people belonged to various professions, like n number of professions. Irrespective of that, still they came together and formed a guild. Here, another point, very important point to be noted, guys, like what we usually think of is if you're born into a certain occupation, you are expected to be stuck to it. Like if your father is a goldsmith, you're also supposed to be a goldsmith, and whoever you give birth to, they are also supposed to be a goldsmith. But here, that is not the case, because people from time to time, if they did not enjoy whatever they're doing, or if they are not satisfied with their work, they immediately changed their professions, right? For example, if they are goldsmiths, right? Like if I'm a goldsmith and I don't like my job, or I'm not interested in being a goldsmith, I can switch occupations because I'm not interested. So there is no rigidity in the social structure or in the professional or in the professionalism, right? You can change you can change your jobs or occupations whenever you want to. So that is source 8. The next is the case of merchants. This is also one small box given in your textbooks. Just like how in last class we have talked about how non-Kshatriya kings, right? Like basically Kshatriyas, whoever belonged to the ruling dynasty, they were supposed to be Kshatriyas. But that is not the case. We have looked at examples of Mauryans, we have looked at examples of Shungas. They belong to different social orders. Some were Brahmins, some belonged to the lower social order. Shakas, though they did not even fit into the fourfold structure, right? So cases like that, we have looked how people did not belong to the Kshatriya social order. In the same manner, we will be looking at examples of merchants here, right? So, Sanskrit texts use the term Vanik to refer to merchants. This is again another term you need to remember, because if you use terms like this in your examination, it is not a mandatory thing again, but if you just use these terms, it will just impress whoever is evaluating your paper, and like he or she will think that you actually went through every line in the textbook, right? So, but it's not mandatory again. If you can remember, just remember. Yes. So here, their merchants were called as Vanik, and according to the Shastras or according to the Brahmanical texts, what we basically know is the trade or traders or merchants was an occupation for Vaishyas. Vaishyas were basically third in the social structure. All the traders have to belong to the varna called Vaishyas. But there are a couple of examples in the ancient times where people did not follow this very strictly, and two examples are given here. The first example is a person called Shudraka. He was an author basically. He was a very well versed author. He wrote a book called Mrichakatika, right? And when did this happen? It happened in 4th century CE, right? So there is always a protagonist for a book if it is a fictional book. So in the same manner, this Mrichakatika also had a protagonist, or in simple terms, a hero, and his name was Charudatta. So while talking about Charudatta in detail, Shudraka mentions that Charudatta belonged to the Brahmin order, like he was a Brahmin, but he was a merchant. According to the traditions, only Vaishyas should be merchants, but here Charudatta was a Brahmin, yet he was a merchant. So people did not follow the rigid social structure. Another instance, this is a 5th century inscription basically describing two brothers who donated for the construction of a temple. Like while discussing about those two brothers, this particular inscription says that they belonged to the Kshatriya order, but they were also Vaniks. Vaniks is nothing but merchants. Again, these two instances basically tell us that, like there are the social realities are very much complex, and the social reality is much different when compared to the actual norms or rules written in the Brahmanical texts, right? Yes. So if you move beyond the four varnas, and the subtopic here is beyond the four varnas integration, right? So there are people who did not fit into the fourfold social structure, and especially because of the diversity of the subcontinent. Like the Indian subcontinent in itself is very huge. Like it's just starts from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, and here you have so many northeastern states, eastern coasts, ranging to almost like northwestern frontiers and stuff, right? It is a vast land. So especially when looking at the diversity of the subcontinent, there existed populations whose social practices were not influenced by Brahmanical ideas, right? Again, let's say all the Brahmins were centered in Pataliputra, right? For example, let's consider all Brahmins were located in Pataliputra. They are sitting in Pataliputra and making all these rules and norms for the Indian subcontinent to follow. And let's say there is a portion of population sitting in Taxila, right? Taxila is far away from Pataliputra. So do you really think the message, whatever the Brahmanas are trying to convey, would have reached all the way to Taxila? Sometimes it is not possible, right? The major reason being the diversity of the subcontinent. Like there are also communication gaps. So all the times it is not possible, and that is why the social practices in some regions were not influenced by Brahmanical ideas. So when it comes to beyond the four varnas, right? There are Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. But if in case Brahmins came across some other occupations or some other people who did not fit into the social order, who did not fit into the fourfold social order, they often categorized them as odd, uncivilized, or even animal like, right? So in the Sanskrit text, they described them as odd, uncivilized, and even animal like. Again, the same examples can be considered here. For instance, forest dwellers, right, who were known as Nishadas, and also nomadic pastoralists. Nomadic pastoralists are basically people moving from one place to another. That is basically called nomadic, right? They did not speak Sanskrit language. They did not know anything about the Indian classical languages. They spoke some non-Sanskrit languages. They were often referred to as Mlechas, just like how Shakas were referred to as Mlechas and barbarians. These category of people were also called as Mlechas, and they were often looked down upon. Like they were not treated equally, they were just looked down upon, right? And there is a source 9 in your textbook which is titled A Tiger Like Husband, which again gives you a story, right, from Mahabharata. There is a particular story to it. The story in itself is not important, but just to give you a context of what the story is, it talks about the Pandavas. So Pandavas were basically living in a forest and it was night, so everybody had to sleep. But there was this second of the Pandavas who was awake, right? One Pandava prince was awake to safeguard, like to make sure that everything is safe, right? So, in the meanwhile, there exists another Rakshasa. Like the term Rakshasa is important here. Rakshasa, and his sister, right? Like his sister was named Hidimba. So Hidimba actually comes to Bhima. Bhima is the person who is safeguarding his brothers, right? So Hidimba comes to Bhima, and Hidimba tells Bhima that Hidimba wants to marry Bhima, right? So just like that, the story continues. Eventually, there are negotiations, and finally, Yudhishthira, the elder son of Pandavas, he agrees to the marriage of Hidimba and Bhima and says yes. And there were some provisions given, some rules established, and all that stuff. That is not what we are concerned about here. We are concerned about the term Rakshasa. So, what historians are referring to is that Rakshasa is also considered to be a occupation or a profession, right? So that is how the term Rakshasa was looked up, was considered. So they are telling that even Rakshasas did not fall into the fourfold social order, and that is why they are called as odd or uncivilized, right? So just imagine, guys, how fantasizing that is, because if you hear the word Rakshasa, which we have heard so many times, did we ever associate it with a profession or like some kind of occupation? We never did, right? Like we always thought of Rakshasa as a evil figure or something like that, but we never associated it with occupations. That is why this analogy of source 9 is very interesting, like very very interesting. Yes, so that is beyond the four varnas integration. The next subpoint to it is beyond the four varnas subordination and conflict. Here, yes, there is even more social divide as the time progressed, because there was another element called untouchables, or another group of people, let's say untouchables, who were added to the varna system, right? So basically here varna system becomes 4 plus 1. I am not calling it 5 varnas. Please understand this concept clearly, guys. It is not called a five-fold varna structure. It is still called a four-fold varna structure, but plus 1. That plus 1 is nothing but untouchables. I will tell you why it is called 4 plus 1 and not 5 in the next slide. But for now, just focus on how there was a sharper social divide when untouchability category was introduced, right? So here, why they were considered untouchables, right? What is the notion behind it? Some activities, like whatever activities are connected with rituals or something related to religion, they were often considered sacred, and because they are sacred, they are by extension considered pure. Like there is always purity when it comes to religion. And In contrast to this purity concept, some activities are regarded as polluting. So here clearly we have two extreme ends. One is purity and the other is polluting, right? Very important to be considered. Some activities are considered pure, some activities are considered polluting. So untouchables were categorized as they were considered under polluting category here. And pure people, they would refuse to take food from the untouchables. And sometimes not just the touch of these untouchables, but also even if you come across or look at some random untouchable, even then it was regarded as polluting. So not just the touch, but the mere sight was also regarded as polluting, right? So here, what did the polluting activities actually include, right? Like, why are they called polluting people? Mainly because their occupation involved handling corpses and dead bodies, dead animals, sorry. Corpses is nothing but bodies, like dead bodies, right? So whenever there was a dead body found or a dead animal found, the main job of these untouchables is that they were supposed to dispose these bodies off in the outskirts of the village. So they are dealing with something which is dead, which basically means there are so many germs or viruses or bacteria surrounding that dead body, because of which the person who is handling them will be polluted, right? I hope you understand why they are called polluting people, right? Yes. So these polluted people or untouchables, they also had a specific category known as chandalas, who were basically the bottom of the hierarchy. If you move on to the next slide, this is a pyramidal figure which clearly tells you what the Varna system looked like back in those times. We know till here, we have talked a lot about till here, right? We know Brahmins, we know Kshatriyas, we know Vaishyas, and we also know Shudras. Here, we're talking about a new concept called untouchables. If you see, there is a gap here. Like all these four structures, they are clubbed into a pyramid. But if you see untouchables, there is a gap. So this gap basically represents that untouchables did not belong to the fourfold social structure. In fact, they were considered as something outside the fourfold social structure. That is why it is not called as fivefold, but it is always called as 4 plus 1, right? So untouchables were always towards the bottom of the Varna system. Yes. Moving on to the next slide, here we have a couple of duties of chandalas which the Manusmriti mentions, right? Again, Manusmriti we have read in the previous classes. It was written from 200 BCE to 200 CE, right? And this particular Manusmriti mentions some of the duties of chandalas. Chandalas are basically untouchables. Number one, they are supposed to live outside the village. They are not allowed to live in the village premises. Number one. Number two, they are always supposed to use discarded utensils. Like normal people, like if there are any utensils which they discard, chandalas are supposed to use these utensils. And they were forcibly made to wear clothes of the dead, and also the ornaments whatever they were wearing, they are made of iron. Like generally if you see the normal people, either they are made of gold or silver or sometimes copper or even sometimes some precious stones, right? Like jasper, lapis lazuli, we have come across so many stones. But if you look at chandalas, their ornaments are only supposed to be made of iron, which was considered a cheap metal back in those times. Yes. And the next point is they could not even walk in the cities and villages at night. Like if they have to enter a particular village, they were supposed to take permission, like prior permission from the village head, that they have some work in the village or city, and that is why they have to enter. Like they have to inform the village headman first. And let's say for example a person died, but he or she does not have any family or relatives to dispose of their body, then chandalas come into the picture. They actually dispose the body of the person who doesn't have any relatives, and not just that, they also serve as executioners. So here the term executioners, if you compare it with present day 21st century, right, like even now when a person dies, there are certain rituals to be performed, or if the person is not being buried, sometimes the person is burnt, right? Like in that case, the person who is responsible for firing, like putting the fire to that corpse, right, like the dead body. So these are some of the things which executioners perform. So in that case, now that there are no relatives, chandalas actually become executioners. And these are another two instances which are written by Chinese pilgrims. There is one Chinese Buddhist monk called Fa Hian. In some textbooks you will find his spelling to be this, sorry, Fahian, Fahian, but in your textbook it is written as Faxian. Both of them are correct, that's not a problem. So this Chinese Buddhist monk Fahian, he visited India in 5th century CE, and he wrote in one of his accounts that whenever an untouchable or a chandala is entering a village, he or she needs to make some kind of sound, let's say a sound, a clapper in the streets, right? Just that sound is just to indicate that like listen people, there is a chandala coming into the village, and if you don't want to see the chandala, please don't come onto the streets. So that is like a warning or an intimation to the people living in the village if they don't want to see chandalas, so that they have to make a some kind of noise while they are entering the village. And another Chinese traveler by name Huan Zhang, which we've earlier come across again, he wrote that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the village, right? Like here I've mentioned the point already, they are supposed to live outside the village, right? And if you look at some of the non-Brahmanical texts, like texts which are not written by and for Brahmins, if you look at them, and historians actually did read a lot of them, they were trying different methods and analyzing so much to find out whether Chandalas accepted the life of degradation, or was there a different social reality, right? So this is a question we need to ask ourselves. Obviously there are so many duties or norms or rules for chandalas, that they have to live outside the village, they're supposed to wear ornaments of iron, like all the list I've just mentioned. Did chandalas actually accept these? Were they obeying all these rules, or were they disobeying and there was a different social reality existing, right? So this is one important question we need to ask ourselves, and in the later slides we will have an answer to this, so just keep this question in mind. Yes, the answer lies in the source 10 of your textbook, which is basically the bodhisatta of a chandala. The source 10 is named as the bodhisatta of a chandala. Again, the same question is asked here. Did they resist the attempts to push them to the bottom of the social order? This is again a story, in fact a long story this time, but if you listen to the whole story you will definitely find an answer to the question. So just please pay attention for a couple of minutes here. This is a story from Matanga Jataka. So I've told you all what Jatakas are, right? So Jatakas are basically these Buddhist texts where majorly the stories revolved around the previous births of Buddha. Like, again, it might be fictional, like it is fictional. So they talk about the previous lives of Buddha. There are n number of Jatakas, and one of them is titled Matanga Jataka, and it was a Pali text. Like, the primary language in which it was written was Pali, and we have a story from that Matanga Jataka. Here, if what is meant by Bodhisatta, right? Like, Bodhisatta is the name of Buddha, but in a previous birth, right? So here, whenever I'm using the word Bodhisatta, remember it is Buddha, but in a different birth. He was identified as a Chandala, like he was a untouchable in this story, right? So here the story starts. I will just go point by point so that y'all will have a clarity of what the story is, right? Bodhisatta was born outside the city of Benares as a Chandala's son and was named Matanga. Again, all these points are pretty self-explanatory, guys. So just follow the story in a linear manner so that you'll have a great idea about what the story is, right? So he was born outside the city of Banaras and he was Chandala's son, and his name was Matanga. Remember the name Matanga, right? Then one day he had some work in the city. Usually he is supposed to stay outside the city, but that particular day he had some work in the city and he went to the city to carry out his work. And in his way, he encountered Ditta Mangalika. The woman's name is Ditta Mangalika. And who was she? She was the daughter of a merchant, right? So Ditta Mangalika saw Matanga. As soon as she saw Matanga, she exclaimed, I have seen something inauspicious, right? In the previous slide, I was mentioning how not just the touch of the untouchables, but also the sight of the untouchables is considered as polluting, right? So she immediately utters to herself that I have seen something inauspicious, and then she washes her eyes, right? So Matanga was very much offended because of this, and obviously people surrounding, they were not happy, and they very badly they hit Matanga, right? So Matanga was very badly beaten, and he was not happy, obviously, just because some person saw Matanga, and this particular Ditta Mangalika was unhappy by looking at Matanga, and people hit Matanga, right? So it doesn't make any logical sense, and it is very valid on Matanga's part to be furious. So what did he do? In protest, he laid down himself at the door of her father's house. Like, he went to her house basically and just laid himself down at the door of her house. So, as a protest, like he was just saying that whatever you all did was wrong, right? So after a couple of days, he recovered from all those beatings, and then this person by name Ditta Mangalika, he carried him to the Chandala settlement. Like, basically, she took him to his own house. And he was all very disturbed because of the incident. He finally decided to renounce the world, right? And somehow he renounced the world. He attained spiritual powers, and after attaining spiritual powers, he comes back again to the village and asks her daughter to give Ditta Mangalika in marriage to him, right? And for somehow her father agrees, and they both marry. Ditta Mangalika and Matanga marry, right? So eventually, as days passed by, they were blessed with a son called Mandavya Kumara. Again, the name is important here. Remember till the story is finished. There is a son called Mandavya Kumara, and he was very well versed with Vedas, right? Like, Again, the story, according to the story, he's a Chandala. He's not supposed to read any of the Vedas or Upanishads. But the point to be noted here is that Mandavya Kumar actually had a lot of knowledge about Vedas because he read all the Vedas and Upanishads while growing up. And he also provided food for 16,000 Brahmins every day. Like, I'm not talking about one particular incident or a function. Like, every day, he used to provide food for 16,000 Brahmins, right? So, that is one part of the story. And the other part is one day Matanga actually appears at his son's doorstep and he begged for food. Like, he comes in the form of a beggar, not as his father, and he asks for food. What does Mandavya Kumar say is that Mandavya Kumar looked at Matanga and kind of came to a conclusion that Matanga did not belong to the Brahmin order and therefore he was unworthy of the alms as the food was only meant for Brahmins. Here I've told 16,000, but all the 16,000 people were Brahmins only. Like, he served food only to the Brahmins. And obviously he thought that Matanga was not a Brahmin and he was very reluctant in serving the food to him. Right? This is the last part of the story. Matanga was very furious because his son was not giving him food and he made a statement, quote unquote, those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings. The statement in itself is pretty self-explanatory, guys. But just again, vices basically mean bad deeds, right? Like bad deeds or bad doings, like wrongdoings. So whoever did some evil activities or evil works, they are not worthy of gifts or offerings. That is what Matanga says. By listening to such huge statement made by Matanga, Mandavya obviously lost his temper and he called a couple of people who were beside him and asked them to throw his father out from the place because he lost his temper. And yes, Matanga disappeared, like he flew into the air. And eventually, Ditta Mangalika, who was the wife of Matanga, she got to know that this particular incident happened and she rushed behind Matanga and asked to forgive their son. Right? Again, this is just a simple story mentioned in your textbook, but what are the important points to be considered here, right? One important and major question here is what happened to the social order and how did Chandalas attain spiritual powers? This is just a story again, but if you look at the details of it, Matanga, firstly, he was a Chandala man, and according to the Brahmanical texts, Chandalas were not allowed to read any spiritual texts or they were not allowed to gain any spiritual powers. And also, Mandavya Kumar, despite being a Chandala, he was very much well equipped with Vedic knowledge and he started serving like Brahmins, right? Like here in this slide, if you see, Brahmins actually started eating food from eating food offered by a Mandavya. In the previous slide, we saw how they did not take food given by untouchables, but here Brahmins themselves ate food offered by Mandavya Kumar. You know, like there are so many contradictions here. If you look at every point, there is a contradiction, right? Uh, Another contradiction being basically Ditta Mangalika, who belonged to the Vaishya's social order. She married a untouchable. Again, this marrying outside the fourfold caste system was not something which was advised back in those times. But again, it is a contradiction here. So, like every point you see in this story is a contradiction to the Brahmanical rules or Brahmanical texts. So, that is why we need to clearly understand, and we need to also remember that whatever is mentioned as a part of the Brahmanical text, they should not be considered at the face value. Instead, every point to be analyzed has to be analyzed, because the social realities are very much different. They are far from what is written in the texts, right? So that is it we have for today. I think we have covered portions till the third subtopic in your textbook. We will continue with this in the next class, but before leaving, if you all want to subscribe for Unacademy Plus or Unacademy Iconic, you can use my code, which is TUM10, and get a 10% off straight away. And yes, guys, again, feel free to drop in any comments or any suggestions or any questions you all have in the comment box, because this is not a live class, right? This is a premiered class, because of which we didn't have a live platform to interact and clear your doubts. So please, please, please put down any questions you have in the comment section. I will reply to all of those comments by the end of the day when the video is premiered. So yes, I hope everybody understood today's content. It was pretty simple, but a greater explanation was needed. That is why I could only cover few pages today. I think I only covered like 3-4 pages today, but because it needs a lot of explanation, right? So I hope that's clear to everybody. Please put down questions in the comment section if y'all have any. And if you like the content of this videos, please do like the video once the premiere is over, and comment down below on the video, and also subscribe to the channel Unacademy. Also, thank you so much guys for tuning in. I hope everybody understood today's class, and we will meet again tomorrow at 6 p.m. to continue this chapter. And there are so many interesting topics, so many interesting facts about social life. We will learn about them in tomorrow's class. Until then, take care, you guys. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you so much.